Good morning, everyone. My name is Jen Bruner. I'm the event coordinator for the Washington Winegrowers. With me is my colleague, Kelsey Gust. She will be handling all of our technical things today. Washington Winegrowers serves the industry through education and state and federal advocacy for vineyard and winery operations. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and we would also like to give a big shout out thank you to our AP sponsors. Those are Ceres, Columbia Label, and Inland Desert Nursery. We thank them for all of their continued support. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. First, the webinar is being recorded. Once we get that all cleaned up and ready to send out, anyone who has registered will get a copy of the webinar, so you can go back and reference for further use if you would like to. To facilitate questions as the webinar is in motion, you can use the question and answer feature. One of our presenters is going to be monitoring that, and will get to the questions possibly right as they pop in, or at the end of this webinar. The last 10 minutes or so will be meant for a question and answer session. So at that time, you'll be able to unmute yourselves and ask live questions, or at that time, the questions and answers that have been typed in will be addressed. If we don't get to all the questions in the allotted time, we will put together a document with any unanswered questions, get them answered, and send those to everyone who is registered as well. I know there's already been some questions about how to get the certificate that is going to be offered at the end of the seminar. So what we are going to ask is, near the end, you will enter into the chat feature everyone's name that has attended and their personal email address, so that we can send the correct certificates to the right people. I know a lot of wineries will register, one person will register a bunch of different people, all under one email address. And so what we want to make sure we get is actual attendees information with name and email address. That will be reminded to you to do that later in the webinar. At the end of this webinar, we also will have a survey. We ask that you take a couple minutes of your time. It's a quick, easy QR code that you can scan onto your phone, and it'll pop up the survey. Quick answers can be added in. We appreciate any kind of feedback that we can get, so we know from here on how we should continue to plan and what is valuable to you in the industry. So at this point, I would like to introduce and do a pre-thank you to our two presenters today, Dr. Thomas Hennickling-Klein of WSU, and Dr. Randy Warbo of Cornell University. I now welcome them to the screen, and I ask that they will both in turn give a quick introduction of themselves. So why don't we go ahead and start with Dr. Hennick-Klein.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you, Washington Winegrowers, for doing all the legwork on organizing this seminar and hosting it. It's my pleasure to be here today with my longtime colleague, Dr. Randy Warbo. I guess for those who don't know me, I'm the director of the Viticulture and Enology program at Washington State University. I'm an enologist, and I worked for 20 years at Cornell University, where I met Dr. Warbo when he started there. And one of the first things I asked him is whether he would have a look with me at wineries because of his background in sanitation and food processing, food safety. So I dragged him to some wineries in New York, and from that, he's developed an outstanding program for wineries, winery sanitation, but also now with the Food Safety and Modernization Act, he will also talk about how these rules affect wineries specifically. And I will leave it. Oh, I should say a little bit more about Randy. So Randy joined Washington State University, Cornell University I keep making that mistake. Sometimes I think I'm still at Cornell. Sometimes I'm at Washington State University. In '97, right, Randy? And he's worked in basically all food environments, looking for the bad bugs, the microorganisms that can make people sick or just cause food spoilage. I saw that he's done work in orchards and other areas of food where the food is grown, in any kind of food processing facility, I assume by now. And he's done that also, not just in the US, but overseas as well. He is a very well-known researcher in his field with a large number of publications. And what I appreciate much about him is not only is he a great scientist, but he loves to apply these new findings and help producers to make the best use of them. Randy, do you want to take it from here? Add some more information, maybe?
Just that I just celebrated my 25th year at Cornell, August 1st. So time goes by quickly. The only other thing that I wanted to say is that in 1997, Thomas and I actually put on, it was the first workshop that was dedicated to wineries and breweries, focusing on sanitation based on the tours that we did. And we saw that there was some need for training and just overall education in the wine industry. And so it positioned New York very well, because when TCA became an issue in California, New York had already had a good grasp and control of their winery cleaning and sanitation programs. That's about it.
Yeah, and I think with that, we want to add, I mean, we all know that luckily, luckily, food pathogens do not survive wine. So winemakers were always safe in that they would not kill someone with the pathogens that they accidentally introduced. But I always believed, and you can see many examples, if your winery is really clean, that's also going to reflect in the flavors of your wine. They're going to be brighter and cleaner. So there's certainly always a benefit to keeping things clean and well sanitized. So we'll start with the sanitation first, right?
Yep. Yeah, just to follow up on that. Yeah, I mean, wineries have always been under TTB and the inspection, and then some of the regulatory oversight is actually FDA if you're 7% or below. But there was a large outbreak due to Peanut Corporation of America, which spurred a new regulation, which is called the Food Safety Modernization Act. And this is where wineries got a little bit more formal regulation by the FDA. And that's what the second part of this seminar is going to be, is the requirement for food safety training for employees. Now, this is a train the trainer. So you can take the slides and the information and you can train everyone else in your facility. There are no regulatory requirements for that. So to start off with, we're going to go with the sanitation. I encourage any questions if you have them. At the beginning, they said, put it in the question and answer anything that you might have by the end of the talk. So let's get into this. So a lot of wineries identify that cleaning and sanitation is actually expensive because of the chemical costs, the labor costs. But fortunately, if you're doing a good job, it results in improved finished results, like Thomas said. In addition, a bit more on the prevention side is that by eliminating the microbes through a routine cleaning and sanitation program, you prevent the buildup or the formation of biofilms. And what biofilms are is when you have microorganisms on the surface of can be any surface, and you've got nutrients there, which is either wine or it can be the juice itself. The microorganisms grow and they basically produce an extra polysaccharide, which I call microbial snot. And what it does is it sticks to that surface, and then it hardens, but the microorganisms are in there and they can still live off of the juice or the wine that's there. But that what happens is that they slough off, and it just expands through your facility. And once the biofilms are there, it's also very, very difficult to get rid of them. It's almost like concrete. And some companies have had to actually resort to ultrasound, and then some companies have actually had to replace equipment because it was such a significant biofilm. If you haven't had a cleaning and sanitation program in place, and you've only been doing it sporadically, that's probably what you're associating the cost with, is that it takes a lot of extra chemicals and labor to actually get it clean. But if you do it routinely, that equipment is clean, and it actually takes a lot less time and chemicals to keep it clean. And finally, screw ups happen. So if you've been doing clean and sanitation religiously, and then you forget one time to sanitize, because that equipment has been so clean and you've been sanitizing, if you forget that one time, it's not the likelihood of compromising your finished product is very low. However, if you're not doing a good job or routine cleaning and sanitation, that one time where you forget to do the minimal cleaning or sanitation that you're doing could result in unsellable product. So to start off, where do these bugs come from? Well, a lot of people think that they're coming in from only certain places, but they're absolutely everywhere. They're on our skin, they're on the equipment, they're on the raw product, the grapes themselves. The thing is that a lot of people think that the microorganisms are attracted to the wine or the juice, but they don't have a practical means of locomotion, and how they actually get around to the different pieces of equipment is through the workers, or it can sometimes be fruit flies that can actually spread the contamination as well. But once they're in there, I mean, they're everywhere, they're easily transferred, and what you want to try and do is inactivate them before they're allowed to take up residence and then possibly spread elsewhere. So you can see that there's a lot of different entryways now, and this is going to be a big thing in the second part in terms of animals. Well, according to FDA, there should be no animals. So winery dogs and cats, I would highly advise that you do not have them in the production area when FDA comes to do an inspection. But the biggest culprit in terms of spreading this contamination around is humans. Now, a lot of there's also, it's not only the humans, but it's the things that they touch. A lot of people forget about wine thieves. And what you really should do is decontaminate your wine thief between barrels, because if that first barrel that you go into has high levels of Brett, and then even though you drain the wine thief out and you go into the next barrel, which may be good wine, you're actually inoculating it. You've become a microbiologist. Excuse me. And in terms of, there shouldn't be any rodents. And in terms of the biggest problem for pests for spreading contamination is that lovely fruit fly that tends to bloom right during the peak of wine production. Now, we call it sanitation programs, but it's actually two steps. It's cleaning and sanitizing. So if you think about your washing machine or your dishwasher, the majority of the time is actually spent cleaning. And that's the same what you should be doing in the winery as well. 90 to 95% of the time should be focused on cleaning, which is removing the soil and organic debris off of the surface. Then you rinse it, and then you put your sanitizer on. And it's a sanitizer that actually kills any remaining microorganisms that might be left on the surface. Now, doesn't matter if it's a line, if it's a tank, if it's a paddle, if it's you should have a 5-step for everything. And what you do first is a pre-rinse with water. You can use reclaimed water for this, and this is just washing off loosely bound organic matter. And the reason for this is that if you don't rinse it off, you're wasting detergent, because the detergent will be bound up by that. And so you're going to have to apply more detergent. So it's actually a cost savings in terms of your chemical costs. Once you apply your detergent, then there's going to be some sort of agitation that's required. And if it's a difficult to reach place, you're going to have to do manual scrubbing. But this is where CIPs substitute the manual scrubbing, because the flow rate results in a turbulent flow, which is your mechanical force that lifts off your organics, and the detergent actually helps lift off the organic. That's why you add it in there. Then you want to rinse. And the reason why you don't want to go directly from detergent to sanitizer is because they're different pHs. So the majority of detergents, especially the ones that are used in wineries, are alkali, and most of the sanitizers are acidic. So if you don't do that rinse, you're actually neutralizing your sanitizer, and then it's outside of the range of efficacy. And then depending on the concentration of your sanitizer, it's a potable water rinse. If it's a lower concentration, according to the manufacturer's recommendation, you can actually leave it on and then do your potable rinse in the morning. But what a lot of places do is they'll do the 5-step, and in the morning it's called a light sanitization, where you put a lower concentration of your sanitizer, run it through the line, just in case, to get rid of anything that might have been missed the day before. Now, in terms of why the majority of the focus is on cleaning, is because you want to make sure to get rid of all that organic matter, because the sanitizers, just like the detergents, are bound up by their organic matter. So if you don't do a good job of cleaning, you're going to be adding a lot more sanitizer than what is actually required, and sanitizers are the expensive ones. We also have different types of organic matter that you want to get rid of. So alkali is good for tartrates, and then what mineral deposits look like is, if you've ever seen a stainless steel tank that looks clean, like it feels clean, and you've done a good job of cleaning, but it has that rainbow or green or purplish hue on it, that is actually mineral deposits. So the harder the water, the more mineral deposits, just because you're using a lot of water to clean and sanitize. And so what you use there is just an acid cleaner. You can actually use just citric acid, and you'll watch it, and it's just all the color slides off the surface. Sanitizing is actually the inactivation of the microorganisms. Now, this is where with sanitizers you want to use the manufacturer's recommended concentrations. Less, you get less effectiveness. More can actually result in adjusting the pH or the optimal conditions, and it gets outside of the most effective range. In addition, those higher concentrations may actually require more water to rinse, to make sure that you don't have any sanitizers going into your wine. We also have what are called cleaner sanitizers, and this is you got to watch out for chemical supply companies, because sometimes they imply that if you use a cleaner sanitizer that you don't have to do a sanitizing step, and that's not true. What happens is a cleaner sanitizer, so a normal cleaner just lifts off the organic matter and the microorganisms, and so it can be spread around, but that's where you rely on rinsing and then your final sanitizing step. But with a sanitizer built into it, what happens is it lifts off and the debris and the microorganisms, and the sanitizer's there, and it activates the microorganisms. So it's an extra antimicrobial step that can result in just higher or lower counts of microorganisms on surfaces, and just an overall higher sanitation. But you still have to do a sanitizing step. Now, how you clean, it depends on what you're actually planning to clean. So for more complicated, like filler heads and stuff like that, you have to manually disassemble and clean them. And it can be by soaking or shaking tables or vibrating tables. Spray methods work great, especially when you hook them up and it's foaming detergent. You can actually see that you're covering the entire surface. For some lines, you can actually make a closed loop, and you can run usually at 3 times the volume for the flow rate, and you'll create a turbulent flow, and that's a CIP, or cleaning in place. Cleaning out of place just means that you're disassembling and taking it apart. There's also a difference between foams and gels. So with if you think about it, if you were to throw up on the wall water and then shaving cream and then hair gel, and think about how long it would take to slide down the wall. So the foam actually goes down slower than if you just sprayed on just the water, and then the gel is even slower. And what that relates to is contact time. So because it slides down that surface slower, you're having a longer contact time and increases your effectiveness for your cleaner to get rid of all your organic matter. And then there is high pressure cleaning. Try not to use it on your drains, because when you high pressure wash your drains, the drain is one of the dirtiest places. And what you're doing is you're just aerosolizing all the contamination, and it can actually go on to clean pieces of equipment, and you can inoculate your product that way. Now, in terms of how to control for these microorganisms, we have either physical or chemical treatments. So filtration is a physical treatment. So prior to bottling, you filter. And so that's a way of getting the microorganisms out. At the same time, majority of wineries, and it's not only in wineries, but it's any beverage or juice manufacturer, filler bowls are notorious for being difficult to clean and sanitize, because the rounded bowl shape, and then at the top, it's because the water never gets into direct contact, you don't have very good cleaning, you don't have very good sanitation, and it's also very difficult to reach even with the best brushes, because it's a restricted access. So what a lot of beverage and wine companies do is they'll actually, for the filler bowl, they will heat it up until the external portion, like the outside of the filler bowl, actually reaches 180 to 185. Now, for the rest of the equipment, there's various chemical sanitizers that you can use. You can use chlorinated ones, and there's many different types of chlorine. There's hypochlorates, there's chlorine dioxide, and I'm going to be going through those. But there's TCA issues with that. California, this is probably 15 or 20 years ago, experienced a lot of TCA issues. But the problem is that the chlorine that they were using was actually being misused. Iodine, because it's in the same periodic column, can also have an equivalent to TCA, but it's iodine based. So it's triiodo-anisole problems. QUATS is a acronym for quaternary ammonium compounds. These are good for the exteriors of tanks. It's not good for equipment that you're going to want to use right away. The contact time of that requires 8 hours. And then what's really become popular in the wine industry is peracetic acid or peroxyacetic acid. Caustic soda, depending on the concentration, can be considered a sanitizer, but in most of the applications in wineries, it's actually being used as a detergent. Now, I'm going to go through each of these more in depth. In terms of if you're using heat, whether it be hot water or steam, you want to target at a minimum 170, but ideally 180 to 185 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm going to go through the problems of all these after I finish this. But in terms of chlorinated compounds, what they do is it's a strong oxidizer, and it decarboxylates the amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins, which is essential for all sorts of enzymes and other proteins that's required for microbial growth. So you can have hypochlorites. It can be sodium or calcium. Your sodium is your household bleach. With these, you have to adjust the pH, because it forms different radicals depending on the pH. And the only germicidal radical is actually hypochlorous acid. And you really don't get anything formed until you're below 8. So typically you want to have the pH of your hypochlorite solution between 6 and 7. Chlorine dioxide is 100% goes into hypochlorous acid. It's not pH dependent. So because 100% goes into the water, you only use like 5 to 7 parts per million. Compared to hypochlorites, you can typically, it's like 200 parts per million. And then acidified chlorines, these are basically your chlorinated compounds that have a buffer, acid buffer in, so that it always gets the correct pH. Just to illustrate what a little bit of acid can do for a hypochlorite solution, the upper line is at a pH 8. And if you take a look at how much time, so 30 minutes, and you still only get like 94% in activation. Whereas if you drop the pH down to pH 6, it's minutes, and you're getting a much greater log reduction. So this is why hypochlorites are widely used in the food and beverage industry, but because of the TCA issues, wineries tend to steer away from that. For iodine, it's a protein synthesis inhibitor. Typically, you target 25 parts per million of iodine. You need so compared to hypochlorites, which was pH 6.7, for iodine, you actually have to go down to 2.5 to 3.5. So with that level of acidity, you can get pitting of your equipment over prolonged use. And just like hypochlorites, where you have the organic matter binding up the hypochlorites, iodine is even more sensitive. So as soon as you have any residual organic material in your system, it's going to be bound up. Quaternary ammonium compounds, they actually just punch holes in the microorganisms, which is not very effective in terms of the kill, because the microorganisms are damaged, but they're not always dead. And so once you remove the quats, then they can repair themselves. So the other thing is that it has a very narrow spectrum of activity, and lactic acid bacteria can readily grow in quats. So if you don't want to have a malolactic fermentation, I would definitely be avoiding using quats. For the acid ionic combination sanitizers, which is your proxy or peracetic acid, it's a very, very strong oxidizer. You have to be careful using this because it's 30% hydrogen peroxide in the stock solution, and workers have to wear face guards and appropriate covering for their clothes and their hands, because if you drop even one drop on leather boots, and you'll see it just eats it up. So the other thing is that it can spontaneously combust, but it has good activity against especially spoilage yeast like Brettanomyces. So this is why a lot of wineries have been going to it. Typically, you target 125 to 250 parts per million. Hydrogen peroxide alone can also be used. It's the strong oxidizing component of peroxyacetic acid, and you can actually use this up to 1100 ppm, which is 1.1%. The problem is that you can't have any exposure to full spectrum light, because as soon as light is exposed, it automatically hydrolyzes to water and oxygen. So it's not advisable to make this up in advance, because it degrades relatively quickly. The last, another one is ozone. Now, it's also a very strong oxidizer, and it creates a supercharged oxygen, and the oxygen wants to get rid of that extra energy, so it basically dumps it off on microorganisms or anything that it comes in contact with, and that actually is how it kills. Has a broad spectrum of activity, but very short half-life. I've had ozone manufacturers that have told wineries that they could make up an ozone solution and use it the next day. That is not true. In terms of short half-life, we're talking seconds. So if you're using ozonated water, you have to have a continual supply of ozone. So if you want a 20-minute contact time, you got to have your ozonator going for 20 minutes with water running the entire time. It's also temperature sensitive. So the solubility of ozone is higher at lower temperatures. So like in Washington during the summer and early fall, you can get very warm days, and if you're not if you're not getting your water from a well source, you may have to have a chiller put on that water to guarantee that you are getting any ozone dissolved in there. Some of the problems with all these sanitizers, so with heat, whether it be steam or hot water, if you haven't done a good job of cleaning and you've got organic matter left on there, you're basically baking that organic matter onto the surface, and it's very difficult to get it to actually remove it. If you're using hot water or steam to treat your barrels, you're going to shorten the life of your barrels, because you're going to be stripping flavors and volatiles from those barrels. For chlorine, as I mentioned, trichloroanisole is a big issue. pH, you have to make sure that you know your pH and how much, and you don't want to have any organic matter. For iodine, it's the same thing, big organic matter sensitivity. It does stain certain types of plastic, but that's just a visual. It stains them brown. And it's not broad spectrum. It's more like quaternary ammonium compounds in terms of it's only active against a few. And then the other thing with quaternary ammonium compounds is, like I said before, you have the buildup of a resistant microflora. So you never want to use this on a daily basis. You can swap it out for, say, any other sanitizer that you're using like once a week. But you have to make sure you have at least 8 hours of contact time. For acid ionic, so that's your peracetic acid, has a narrow spectrum, but it's active against the wine spoilage microorganisms. Hydrogen peroxide, it has oxidizing residues. And how do you get rid of SO2 in wine? Well, you just add in hydrogen peroxide. So if you don't do a good job of rinsing your peracetic acid, or if you're using hydrogen peroxide, you could be eating up your molecular SO2 in your finished wine, and especially in barrels, because it equilibrates. So if you're treating, it'll seep into the staves, and then when you rinse it, there's still some that remains, but when you put the wine in, then it's going to come out, and that's when you think your wine has a good protective molecular SO2 level, it actually might tank over time just because of the residual that's coming out of the barrels. For ozone, you need dedicated equipment, and you have to be measuring to make sure that you actually have ozone coming out of your system. I know one winery that found out that for a year their ozonator was not working, and they had not been using ozonated water for over a year. So every time you're using it, there are tests to actually detect how much the concentration of ozone in the water. It's also a big worker hazard. So if you can smell ozone, which is it's the smell if you've been close to a lightning strike, or if you're an amateur electrician like myself and you get a really good arc, it's that smell. If you can smell it in the work environment, it's already a worker hazard. The workers should be wearing ozone badges. There was one winery I went in, I was doing a training at, and the sanitation crew came in, and they were Hispanic. So for one thing, I'm jealous because they have hair. And then their hair was dark, but they had caps on, and it was all their hair was orange, all 5 sanitation workers. They took off their caps when I was starting to talk, and I could see that where the cap covered, it was not orange. So I went and talked to them, and their hair bleaching was because of the amount of ozone that they were exposed to in that facility. So I went and talked to their manager and said, you gotta provide adequate ventilation for the workers, because it also eats up your lungs very, very fast. In terms of ozone, it's less effective against spores and wild yeast. So it is active, but it's not as active. And then there are some manufacturers that are selling UV units, and I really don't recommend it, because anytime you have any type of shadow, you're getting zero inactivation. And when I say shadowing, it can even be micro scratches on the surfaces of tanks, or even flat solid surfaces. It's really not a good option. Now, some of the things that are complicating for wineries is that you have to deal with wood. The rest of the food and beverage industry is not allowed to have wood in their facility, but you need it to actually age your wines. The thing is that wood, it's not sterile when you start off with. We've isolated Brettanomyces from brand new barrels, even toasted ones. And actually toasting, it breaks down the lignins and provides a substrate that Brettanomyces can actually grow on. Woods is porous, so it means that you can have chemicals that actually go into the barrel, but also Brettanomyces can go inside the barrel up to about 8 millimeters. So it being porous is the reason why the rest of the food industry is not allowed to use it. The other thing is that your products are stored in vats and barrels for extended period of time. You have to think about the rest of the food and beverage industries. They basically produce it, package it, and out the door it goes. So that longer time represents more of a potential for introduction of spoilage or spoilage microorganisms growing while it's being stored. The other thing, and this has changed a lot in the past 15 years, is that the sanitation, like the chemicals, have been designed for other food and beverage industries. So in dairies, they have fat and protein to get rid of. You have tartrates. So the detergents that dairies use for that fat and protein may not, they're not really designed for the type of buildup that you have in your facilities. And then, of course, misconceptions or unsubstantiated claims for chemicals. So this is where ozone can be made up and last for a long time. Misuse of and mixing of chemicals is not the way to go. And then the other thing, because you've got the fermentation of juice to wine is a way of food preservation. So it's a stable food because the yeast have utilized the majority of the nutrients for microorganisms to grow. So you didn't really have a big problem. So cleaning and sanitizing always hasn't been at the top of winemakers' priority list. Drains are also a bugger, just plain and simple, because they're tough to clean, and then they're also wonderful sources for fruit flies. Now, the best way, if you think about it, if you're just rinsing your drain, you're only the effluent is going out the line. You have to remember, if you have a low volume of water, you're not going to be treating the majority of the line that's taken outside of the facility. What you want to do is plug your drain hole up with a towel and tie a rope to it, fill it up. And this is especially good if you have problems with fruit flies. Once it's filled, you basically pull the plug, and what happens is you get much larger surface area coverage of water, and it flushes out any of the residuals that the fruit flies are actually living on. That's a big help in terms of fruit flies. For bottling lines, for the lines you want to ideally CIP, so is ideal because it doesn't require all the long brushes, and you just hook it up and you go through the cycles. Making sure to heat the external filler bowl to 180 to 185, and then the gaskets. Anytime you have rubber gaskets, you shouldn't have any cracks. If you see cracks, it means they have to be replaced. They don't last forever. And if you have any ozone in your facility, ozone eats up those rubber gaskets like crazy. So you're probably going to have to do replacements much more frequent if you're using ozone. I'm not going to go into filters. There's relatively few people that reuse their filters. I don't recommend it. They're not expensive, but there are some wineries that do it. But if you do, you have to do a caustic acid treatment to get rid of any tartrates. And then you want to sanitize with heat, and then pre-sanitize, rinse before you actually run your wine through it. Now, the other thing is that sanitation is a mindset. It's all about not solving the problem, but it's preventing the problem. So by doing a good job of cleaning and sanitizing, you should have less issues in terms of in terms of trying to get rid of a spoilage issue. Initially, the learning curve is steep. Especially if you're hired and you go into a facility and they haven't done cleaning and sanitation in a long time, it's going to take a lot of elbow grease, and it's going to take a lot of chemicals to get it to where it should be. But once it's there, that's when you see the dramatic decrease in chemical usage as well as labor. And then what you want to do is you never want to just have blinders on and say, oh, this is what we do for cleaning for these pieces of equipment. You always want to look around and see where things could be cleaned better or what's being missed. Some of the most common sanitation faults: inadequate cleaning of organic material, just a bad choice of sanitizer for what you're actually trying to decontaminate, being cheap on the sanitizer, so not adding enough. Always use the manufacturer's recommended. And then being impatient. Sanitizers have a contact time that's required to get the kill. And then this happens all the time. You spend all that time to clean and sanitize something, and then you put it on the floor. The floor and drains are dirty. You don't want to do that. So keep your hoses up on the wall and make sure you have the center hook higher so that you get complete drainage of the water out of those lines. And then people just forget about hoses and pumps. they look at the equipment, but they forget to think about the actual transfer, the equipment that's used to transfer your wine or juice. Those all have to be cleaned as well. You always want to make sure to clean, properly prepare your cleaning and sanitizing solution. So this is not take a cup of the detergent, add it into the blue barrel and mix. Now it has to be prescribed so that basically someone walking off the street could follow the instructions and make up the solution properly. And then the other thing that's good is to avoid the buildup of mineral deposits, and there's certain tartrates that are not always soluble with hot water, but rotate your detergents and sanitizers like on a once a week. And here's an example. So assuming that wineries, because it's realistic that wineries only are in production 5 days a week, but on days 1 through 4, use a caustic detergent and a peracetic acid for a sanitizer. And then on day 5, assuming that they get day 6 off, use an acid-based detergent to get rid of the mineral deposits, and then a quat because it has a longer contact time. So here's an example of how to what an SOP for sanitizing solution should be. And then always include how you actually measure the final concentration before the workers actually use it, because you want to make sure it's in that range before you actually go and either add if it's improperly made up, you're going to be adding too much sanitizer or not enough sanitizer. Now, this work was actually done by Thomas and myself. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to see where the biggest issues were in terms of lack of sanitation. And oh God, Thomas, I think this was probably like 2000 or so. And Thomas had really good relationships with the wineries there, as I'm sure he does in Washington, and they allowed us to go in and do a swabathon. So what we picked was the drain the floor, because that's basically like our positive control. Those should be dirty. The bottling line, which should be clean, and then what the wineries referred to as a clean stainless steel tank, and then a full barrel right around the bung. Now, if you take a look at which one is it? It is, yeah, Winery 5. It was a very OCD German winemaker who spent a lot of time making sure the winery was clean, but had Brett issues. Now, the shocking thing is that if you take a look at Winery 5, the barrel, which is the red line, compared to Winery 3, which floors and drains were dirty, what was to be expected, but never had Brett issues. And well, look at around the bung on his barrels, there's absolutely nothing. And this was actually because that winemaker, every time before he went into the barrel and after he was in the barrel, sprayed citric SO2 around the bung before he went in. And you think about the spillage that occurs right around the bung. If you're not decontaminating that, it provides easy access and for contamination into your wine. And this is just a different way to view it. So because of the Brett issue, we were asked what is the best way to sanitize a barrel, and it's not easy, and there was no benchmark out there. So we actually collaborated with it was 3 Constellation brand wineries and then Francis Ford Coppola winery in California, and they were checking, they knew exactly which barrels had Brett, and they let us experiment on 100 naturally contaminated barrels, and we took 20 samples per barrel. They were cleaned using a high pressure wash system, which is standard for majority of wineries. And then the barrels were sampled for spoilage yeast before and after sanitation treatments. And what we did was we did in vitro studies in the lab to see the effectiveness, and then in vivo studies to see how it actually worked in the barrels. So first one was just plain old SO2. This was 150 parts per million of SO2 at 3 different pHs, 3 to 3.4, and this is in test tubes. So you can see that Brett, the lower the pH, the more reduction you get. And with Saccharomyces, because it's SO2 resistant, you don't expect to get much reduction anyways. Zygosaccharomyces is much more sensitive to SO2, but you could see that the SO2 itself is a good sanitizer, but the problem is that EPA has to approve a sanitizer, and SO2 it may be approved now, but up until then you can't say that it's a sanitizer. You can say that it's a processing aid. Now we looked at in the barrels. So the back represents before treatment and the front represents after treatment. Now you can see that we did a 3-week treatment. These were, I think there were 5 gram SO2 discs that we burned. So after 3 weeks, we could still see some. This is just general yeast population surviving, but after 6, there was nothing. So holding it for that longer time actually provides a lot of protection. We look specifically for Brettanomyces, and this one barrel that you can see actually had 100 million CFU in it, but it was still, we got a 99.999% reduction even after 3 weeks. But Brettanomyces with the SO treatment in the barrels worked very, very well. We looked at peroxyacetic acid in the test tubes. We saw that even at the lower concentration, we used 60 and 120. It was non-detectable after 1 minute. So Brettanomyces is very sensitive. Opposite, Zygosaccharomyces was less sensitive. So it was the complete opposite compared to SO2. And just Saccharomyces is also sensitive, but Brettanomyces is more sensitive than Saccharomyces. So we looked at the barrels, and we did a 15-minute treatment with 120 parts per million, and then we did 1 week. And on the right-hand side, you could see that after 1 week, everything was gone. But I caution against this, because that 1 week of holding peroxyacetic acid in a barrel, you'd have a lot of absorption into the wood, and you'd have issues with it leaching out after you put your wine in. But still, you could see we got good reductions even with a 15-minute treatment, but not as good as SO2. Looking at the Brettanomyces population, we were still seeing greater than 90% reduction, and we did have some very high counts, but it's for 15 minutes, it wasn't that bad, but the longer treatment definitely knocked the Brettanomyces completely out. We also looked at steam, because the larger wineries that can afford a steam generator and the system, we were looking at steam between 25 and 35 psi. We had a couple that were higher pressures and blew out the stave. So that was not exactly an ideal. That was just an accident, research accident. We actually put probes from the outside, and we drilled them in what represents 18 and 14 millimeters in depth to monitor the temperature as we filled or as we steam treated. So with the 8 millimeter, we reached 135 roughly Fahrenheit, and at 14 millimeters, we reached about 109 Fahrenheit. In terms of, we sampled the barrels after, and on the right is 5 minutes, and on the left is 10 minutes, and this is just general yeast populations. So you can see that the 10-minute treatment was better at knocking down, and the majority of the inactivation we saw was a 3 log or 99.9% inactivation. The good thing is that Brettanomyces is much more heat sensitive than like Saccharomyces. So even the 5-minute treatment, we wiped out the Brettanomyces, but I would still say to guarantee a 10-minute treatment is probably better. We looked at ozone. Because we could not do the ozone in the lab because the half-life is too short, we just did it with the barrels. So we saw we saw good reductions. We still saw about, even with that one barrel that has the highest blue column at the back, we still saw a good reduction in that. It's just that those counts were very, very high. So 5 minutes at 1 ppm and 10 minutes, but 5 minutes seemed to be equally as effective as a 10-minute treatment. And then with regards to Brettanomyces, so in 5 minutes at 1 ppm, we didn't see any Brettanomyces surviving, but the 10-minute treatment, it had that one barrel that had, once again, had very high levels of Brettanomyces, and we saw about a 97.5% reduction. And then we did a chlorine dioxide. Now remember, chlorine dioxide, doesn't matter if it's hypochlorite or chlorine dioxide, it binds to organic matter, and barrels are organic matter. So this is exactly what we expected. We saw absolutely no reduction with chlorine dioxide treatments of 5 and 10 ppm after 15 minutes. And it was basically the same for Brettanomyces. So it's chlorine is not an option for barrels, but we just wanted to investigate that. Just a final wrap up slide on the sanitation. It's not only, so this is where the viticulturist and the enologist have to be on the same page, because even if you have mechanical grape harvesters, those have to be treated as an equipment, because I've been dragged out to California because they had such high levels coming in on the grapes, and it was because the mechanical harvester had never been cleaned or sanitized, and that harvester was actually inoculating every grape. I'll say it again, you need to focus on cleaning and worry less on sanitizer. And then make sure whatever method you're doing, that you're doing it proper for that equipment. And then finally, make sure to know that your wine is protected at all times, measuring its pH and molecular SO2. And I'll hand it back over to
we would have questions and answers now. I did not see any in the questions and answers box. Jen, do you want to turn on the microphones for the participants? Because we could take 10 minutes, I think, to answer questions live.
Hopefully I didn't go too quickly.
But as we said, if you have questions that pop into your mind after the seminar is over, send them into the Winegrowers, and then we'll forward them to Randy and me, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Thomas, we're in the process of getting it changed to where people can unmute themselves if they choose to. So if anyone has a question they'd like to ask live, just 1 second and you should get a notification that you're able to unmute yourself. Until then, if you do have a question, you can type it into the question. Oh, there's one. Perfect. Or even the chat feature would work.
Okay, Distanex, is that what's another name for that one?
Oh, yes, I have a question.
I don't know who's listening to you yet.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. We use peroxycarb to do our cleaning, and then we use citric afterwards, and then rinse with water. Is that appropriate for cleaning?
That's appropriate for cleaning, but you don't have a sanitation step in there.
All right, so we do need to add the sanitation step after the peroxycarb or after the citric?
So I would probably do it after the citric, and I would do depending on what sanitizer you're going to do, a rinse to flush out the citric, depending on what pH it's coming out of your lines. And I think Distanex is probably the peroxycarb, if I'm not mistaken, because peroxycarb is great at lifting tartrate stains.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And then one of the questions is, are you familiar with sanitizers that contain 15% dodecyl benzyl sulfonic acid and 50% phosphoric acid? So that dodecyl benzene sulfonic acid is very similar to a quaternary ammonium compound. The 50% phosphoric is I assume that is the stock concentration. So I don't think I've seen any studies specifically with that sanitizer, but I would probably treat it the same as a quaternary ammonium compound. Another question, UV light is used in human medicine to sanitize surgery suites. How is this less effective in wineries? So if you go into the only reason why they use it in hospital type situation or locales is it's more for the aerosols that may be there during surgery. So it's about the only way to inactivate it unless you run it through an HVAC system. And it's because you have to think about the sensitivity to contamination. So if you're doing surgery and they have, just like wineries have Brettanomyces, hospitals have it's called multi-drug resistant Staph aureus. And if you get one in the wound or wherever they're operating, it can result in an infection. So it's just more on the conservative side because it's more sensitive. Or susceptible is better term. Other questions?
Randy, you made the point when you mentioned UV that it's just very difficult, almost impossible in a winery situation to get UV to every surface, every nook and cranny in equipment. And I think that's what I understood you thought was the main limitation of UV.
Correct. So if you want to go back to that hospital scenario, they're actually using autoclaves to sterilize the equipment. And what some equipment manufacturers are trying to do is sell UV units as a means to decontaminate the surface. So it's not a good substitute
For surface sanitation.
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, whether it be a contact system, like a wine contact surface or whatever. I didn't scroll down. Okay.
Yeah, which cleaners neutralize the polysaccharide biofilm?
None of them. That's the issue. You have to use strong abrasion, but some of the higher concentrations of potassium hydroxide can actually lift a polysaccharide biofilm. Usually you don't use acid on polysaccharide biofilms. It doesn't really lift it off. So it's mechanical is the best way to get rid of a polysaccharide biofilm. And then have you ever done any testing on concrete vessels? What do you think are the best methods? Yeah. Concrete is that they're tough because it's like wood. They're very porous and they, I mean, I do know wineries that have very large concrete vessels and they use the same 5-step process, but they actually use abrasive brushes to scrub the surface of those concrete vessels. So it's more challenging. Let's put it this way. Clint has a question. How would you store a barrel wet? We have used sulfur sticks in the past and are thinking about switching. I've seen mixed opinions on what's best. I mean, even, regardless, the barrel has to be wet. You can't let it dry out, right? So it's we've seen equal effectiveness with SO2 gas. I mean, we measured the concentration in the headspace and it's right along the same lines as if you use SO2 gas. So just keep your barrel wet to make sure that you got a sealed system. And I don't think making sure that your sticks have burned completely is important too. Have you had experience with a low foam CIP detergent? Is a citric rinse needed with this? So the only reason that you use a citric is to lower the amount of water usage. You can actually just, what you want to do is get the effluent that's coming out with your rinse to be below 7. That's key before you put your sanitizer on. So yeah, citric just minimizes the amount of water that's needed to neutralize your detergent. Other questions? We got a couple more minutes. Oh no, actually it's 2.
what would you recommend for organic wineries? You know, we're limited to proxycarb and peracetic acid.
So, yeah, quaternary ammonium compounds are not considered organic. I would say that your proxycarb is good. I mean, don't get me wrong. And then the peroxyacetic acid is good as well. If you wanted to do and like with the rotation of your sanitizer and detergent. I don't know. I really don't know. Zap has organic alternatives. And I would probably look on their site. I had it in a previous winery talk, but Zap, you go on there and they'll list the organic ones. But I will say this, that chlorine dioxide it is still considered an organic acceptable alternative. It depends on who's doing your organic certification, and you just got to push back a little bit because it is allowed as an organic sanitizer.
What sanitizer would you recommend?
So is this for a winery that's new or has a good cleaning and sanitation program in place?
Yeah, we've had a good cleaning and sanitation program in place.
I would probably stick with the peroxyacetic acid.
Okay, thank you.
You just want to, I mean, unless you're really careful in terms of how you actually use chlorinated compounds, peroxyacetic acid is your better bet.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
Yeah, and then I wouldn't forget high pressure hot water and steam.
Oh yeah, well, that's how much more organic can you get than that?
Yeah, I mean, they're organic.
Then
They take energy, but they're very effective if you can reach the killing temperatures and can hold it long enough, as Randy pointed out.
we have a few more questions. What are the consequences of these sanitizers on wastewater, and how will these affect how we treat wastewater? So there are biodegradable cleaners and sanitizers. The only one that I really know manufactures Zap. And no, I don't get paid from them, but it's just my experience in terms of trying to look for options for wineries. But if you're using the proper concentrations of your cleaners and sanitizers, it should not affect your treatment pond. You mentioned using citric SO2 solution around the bung. What proportion of each is recommended? Well, so typically 350 parts per million of SO2, and get your pH down to definitely below 3.4. So it depends on the hardness of your water in terms of how much you actually have to add. So measuring the pH and your molecular SO2 is the best. Oh yeah, and Deborah pointed out the steam for organics helpful. And then last one, then we'll go on to the food safety training. Do you have a sanitization program template for wineries that covers cellars and boiling line? No, I don't. I mean, no, I've never seen really a template for any kind of food or beverage industry. In that case, this is the other thing I forgot to mention. Your chemical supply companies aren't only there to supply you with chemicals. They should, on an annual basis, go in and take a tour of your facilities, identify locations that you're not getting good cleaning on, recommend alternative detergents, as well as they should be helping you out with that sanitation template. Okay.
And we should go on to the food safety laws as they apply to wineries. And I need to remind everybody, as Jen said, if you would like to have a certificate issued that you completed this training course, you must stay on to the very end and give your name and contact information to Washington Winegrowers, and they'll send you the certificate.
And for the people that don't want the certificate, you can jump off. Thank you for attending. But with that, I'm going to go back and share my screen again. And get rid of this. Okay. So I'll go back. So as I mentioned earlier, this is because of an outbreak that occurred, and it is the most broad sweeping regulation that's been put into place since the start of the FDA. So there are 7 parts to what is called the Food Safety Modernization Act, and the ones that are red are if you're a food or beverage manufacturer, you have to comply with. The ones that are in green are the ones that wineries have to comply with. And the reason is that initially when this regulation was coming into place, they were actually going to have wineries comply with all these sections. And I have to give FDA credit. They listen to the industry and they listen to the experts, guiding them, saying this is going to create a very big issue. And especially when wine is protective in itself against foodborne pathogens, it's because of the alcohol. The alcohol inactivates pathogens relatively quickly. So what you have to have are it's subpart A, which is just general provisions in terms of chemical handling and that, but there is a component that is a requirement, and every wine worker has to receive food safety training. And this, it does not prescribe that it has to be given by someone that is an expert. So this is why this is a train the trainer. So you can take this information and once a year, just train your staff. So bring them into the lunchroom, have a piece of paper, get them to sign, print their name and sign. And that's evidence that they received food safety training once a year. And then just what are called current good manufacturing practices. And I'm going to go through what is actually part of that. And then records. Okay. I know that records are a pain, but these records that most of them apply to the chemicals that you use in your cleaning and sanitation program. So I'm going to go through in terms of all the record keeping, what type of records you should be collecting. So a lot of wineries have never had an FDA inspection. And what they do is, if it's actually FDA, not a state inspection, but they will actually give you a notice of inspection. So they don't just show up. They will tell you that they're going to come and inspect. And then usually they want to inspect you when you're in full production. Now, at the same time, when they come and, you know, it's a Monday, a typical Monday where everything has gone wrong and you've got all sorts of problems that day, you can actually tell them today's not a good day and set up an alternative date, and then they'll come back and do it that way. Do not meet them with aggression, and because they will push back. And let's put it this way, regulators will always win. Okay. In terms of what they're allowed to see, they're allowed to inspect your facilities, and they're allowed to take photographs because that's evidence or for their documentation for their inspection report. They'll want to take a look at your CGMP records, training records, which is your food safety training, your SSOPs, which are your sanitary standard operating procedures, and then your SOPs, which are standard operating procedures for how you make up your chemicals. They will ask for office space for their inspection. But in terms of the general amount of time that they'll spend inspecting your facility will be probably just a couple hours. But they will be in the facility to go and ask questions until they're finished or satisfied with their inspection. Now, this is your basic training for CGMPs and SSOPs. So what they call prerequisite programs, this is the minimum food safety requirements that any food or beverage production facility should have. And it's basically your CGMPs and SSOPs that make sure that the conditions that you're operating around they're basically the basic basis for what's called HACCP system, which is what FSMA is all based on. It's called Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point System. Now, of the prerequisite programs, this is what I'm going to be focusing on. These are your sanitation standard operating procedures. And it says each processor shall. And when it says shall, it means you have to have and implement sanitation standard operating procedures that address the specific sanitation conditions and practices before, during, and after processing. So it means that before you start up, you have to prove that it's been cleaned and sanitized. You have to make sure that you're not doing anything that would make your product adulterated while in production. And then after processing also includes your cleanup, but also where your storage warehouse. Now there's 8 key areas that FDA is going to be inspecting you against, and I've got them numbered here. The first one is safety of water. And you think about how much water is used in the facility, not only for cleaning, sanitizing, but it's also employees washing their hands and what they drink. So this is why it's number 1 on FDA's list. They want to look at it's your condition and cleanliness of food contact surfaces. So they can't ding you on the barrels because that is part of it. But if you have wood and like wood paddles, it would be okay. But typically you want to make sure that all your food contact surfaces are of non-porous, easily cleaned fabrication. You want to prevent cross-contamination. So they're going to be looking to see if you have any potential for chemicals that get into your wine. So the only time your chemicals should be out on your floor, your cleaning and sanitizing, is when you're actually doing your cleaning and sanitizing. The other thing is, do not have any common or abrasive powder located anywhere in your production area, because it looks the same as metabisulfite or benzoate if you're using it, and they'll ding you on that. The other thing, do not have a can of Raid, because that is considered a pesticide a pesticide, and you're not allowed to have that in the production floor. And they want to check and make sure that you have hand washing, hand sanitizing toilets for your workers. And then they're going to be looking for protection from adulterants. For wineries, it's most likely going to be chemicals. And then for any of your cleaning and sanitizing chemicals, you have to have them properly labeled. So when you buy your chemicals, that label that's on there, when you put it into a working container, you have to have that same label on there. You can't just put sanitizer on the bucket. They will ding you for that. And then you are supposed to be checking your employee health conditions every day that you're in production. And then you want to exclude pests. So I'm going to go through this quickly. So what they're looking for in the safety of waters, and make sure that there's no cross connections between potable and non-potable water sources, because there have been situations where you can get back siphonage and it contaminates the water supply. And that would be a bad thing for the winery itself, because that contamination could get into the wine too. And you would have spoilage microorganisms in there. And why they focus on water is because it's used so much to transport products, wash. Wineries don't wash the grapes before they come in, but they use it to clean and sanitize the facilities, the utensils, containers, and equipment. And you should be rinsing out cleaning and sanitizing the bins that you're harvesting your grapes in. That can be a source of spoilage contamination. And then your employees use it for drinking. So the wineries are different because most of them don't have municipal water sources, but they do have most of them have private wells, at least in the ones I've seen. So you have to be checking to make sure, and you have to go with what your state requires in terms of making sure that the water is not contaminated. So you have to send it away for an E. coli test. In New York, I believe it's once every 6 months. If you have municipal, great, because all you have to do is request the municipality water report once a month and put it into your records. If you do have a well, you want to make sure to check that your well is intact, it's not cracked, and you want to have a seal on it to make sure that nothing can get in there. And the reason why you don't want to have cracked is because you can actually have infiltration of, if you have a flood. Well, Washington doesn't get much flooding, but in upstate New York, when we get 5 inches in 45 minutes, you can get pooling of water, and then it basically contaminates your well. And anytime that you have a cracked well, it can infiltrate or contaminate the water supply. What they are going to be looking for is if you have any sinks and you've got a hose down below, you want to make sure that that hose is above the highest level of the sink. Otherwise, they say you can get back siphonage through that. So just take an X-Acto knife and cut it off so it's above the sink, and that's the best way. So just check for cross connections, any potential backflow or back pressure, back siphonage. Now, in terms of food contact surfaces, it's exactly what it says. Anytime that any of your juice, your grapes, or your wine comes in contact with it, you want to make sure that these surfaces are in good condition. It also includes other things that, well, you guys don't use cutting boards and tables, but it can be your sorting table, your bins, your tanks, your filler heads. And then if your workers have gloves or aprons, those are food contact surfaces, because you know what what the workers look like at the end of the day. If the juice or the wine can get onto them, the contaminants can go from the clothes back onto into the product. So for food contact surfaces, this is the general requirements. You want to have a safe material. So no galvanized, which galvanized actually has a lot of heavy metals, and under acidic conditions, it leaches these out. And that's why they can't be used as food contact surfaces. You want it non-absorbent, so it can be drained or dried. You want it to be resistant to corrosion. So this is why ferrous-based equipment is not wanted in the facility, and you want it inert cleaning and sanitizing chemicals. In terms of fabrication, you want to add it so it can easily be cleaned and sanitized. And if you have any seams that have been welded because it's been modified, they have to be absolutely smooth, because FDA looks at an uneven weld like I would be able to do as a violation. It has to be smoothed out or ground down so that it's completely smooth. Then this is standard. So I'm using this because this is a standard food safety training. What they say that examples that should be normally avoided is wood, because it's porous and you have microbial concerns, ferrous metals, brass, because you can actually have lead being leached out from brass components, and galvanized metal because of corrosion and chemical and heavy metals being leached out. So you just what you want to monitor is just the condition. You don't want to see pits, you don't want to see rust or anything like that. And you don't want to see evidence of it being dirty if it's supposed to have been clean and sanitized. You should be they want you to be monitoring the concentration of your sanitizers and your detergents. So you can use test strips, you can use that are specific for those sanitizers. And then if you do supply gloves and garments, you want to make sure that they're not torn and ratty. You can do a visual inspection, and you want to make sure that the surfaces are in good condition, that that it looks clean and sanitized, and that the gloves and outer garments are clean and in good repair. In terms of the chemicals, you want to use the correct sanitizers, and on your standard operating procedures, you should have a target concentration. And then on your testing or your monitoring sheet, you should have your target concentration, and your employees should write down the actual concentration that they see. And then you can also do verification checks, which is basically like an ATP luminometer. For prevention of cross-contamination, what they want is to avoid biological or chemical cross-contamination into your finished wine. Chemical is very difficult to get rid of. So if you have excessive levels of sanitizers and it ends up in your wine, there's not much you can do. So there's no real remediation. Whereas with biological, the wine itself, because of the alcohol, is going to inactivate that. So the whole thing is try and protect cross contamination, whether it be chemical or biological. And this really doesn't apply to you because of the way that wine is made, but they would like to see the grape separate from the wine. So have it in a linear flow through the facility. You want to have separation, protection of the products and that you have in storage, and then just making sure that the food handling or the processing areas and the equipment has been properly cleaned and sanitized. This is the other thing that you have to check is employee hygiene. So technically, according to the regulation, an employee is supposed to be showered every day. And that is a very difficult situation to try and tell an employee that they have to go home and shower, because you can tell that they haven't. And then you want to make sure that they're washing their hands after going to the bathroom. And then in terms of the employee, how they handle the food and their utensils. So one thing I can say is that watch how they use how employees use your paddles when you're doing a press down. Because no utensil should be on the floor. And then just they want to make sure that only the production employees are actually in the production area, and that you don't have a stream of people that aren't actually working in that area. Examples of poor employee practices: handling juice and then handling fermented wine ready for bottling, working near on the floor, then handling the product, and then returning from the restrooms without washing their hands. So yeah, the person inside the tank with rubber boots and no gloves or apron, FDA would probably they'd probably talk to you about it, but it would be, I don't think it would be considered a major deficiency, simply because it's part of the actual process. Yeah, so here's the example. If you see in the picture, those are utensils and those are considered food contact, and they're on the ground. So if you do not want that to occur, you shouldn't, because not only is it's a safety issue, but it's more of a spoilage issue for you guys. In terms of just employee practices, if you scratch their face, they shouldn't be handling the product. And then, but there's not much manual handling of the actual product, because once it's in a liquid, it's all being pumped. Some of the sources of contamination that could cross-contaminate, this is exactly this. This is directed for pathogens, but it's the same for your spoilage organism. Plant personnel, you see in the picture, you have those hoses on the ground right beside the drain. Well, you can easily get contamination that way. Now, employee practices. Now, you have technically you have to comply that there's no rings or jewelry in the actual production area. So in terms of the gentleman with all the ear piercing and everything that's on his face, yeah, that would not be allowed, because it could potentially fall out and contaminate and then get into your product. So, and they want to see hair nets and beard nets, but FDA has relaxed that requirement for the winery. So it's just this is what they expect to see if you're outside of a winery. Now, this is what the gentleman on the side that has skid marks, that is definitely a no-no. Okay, FDA would take issue with that, because you can see that this was actually in a seafood facility, and you can see that there's crab meat on the back of his pants. Well, it's because he's going with his hands, lifting up his pants, and then going into the crab. So you can see the direct fecal contamination potential there. And then there should be no makeup application or meds being taken on the production floor. That should be in a dedicated lunchroom or outside of the facility. The main reason why they encourage hand washing is because it's a major vector for spreading foodborne pathogens. So you want to make sure that you have adequate soap, and you have hand washing station or a sink, and then disposable towels. Here's how to there's actually a procedure how to properly wash your hands. Remove all jewelry, wet your hands with warm water, then take your soap and lather, and then rinse, dry with a paper towel, and then use that paper towel if you've got a handle on the door to open the door so that you don't recontaminate your hands. So I think this is also a good slide because sometimes the owners or upper management aren't the best for following the rules. So if the winery has a policy for their employees that there's no watches or jewelry on the production area, and the owner or manager comes in and violates that, you should actually set the best example. Training, you want to do this training with your employees at least once a year. And then if you see an employee that's doing something that is not considered proper, you want to retrain them, stop them, and then retrain them. And then providing your employees adequate facilities so that they can actually have proper hygiene. In terms of hand washing, hand sanitizing, and toilet facilities, they basically want to make sure that they have these to avoid any contamination. So here's an example of good bathrooms, and the bottom one is a bad bathroom example. So if you have unclean bathrooms, the employees are not going to want to go in there and use it. So they will inspect, and they want to make sure that your bathrooms are in good condition. You want to make sure that your hand washing areas are clean at all times. And there's actually state laws, and it varies from state to state in terms of the requirement. But in New York, any entry into the production area, you're technically supposed to have a hand washing station, and it's dedicated for hand washing only. You want to, in terms of what should be at that hand washing station, liquid soap, you want to have water. It doesn't have to be hot. And then disposable paper towels. I would not recommend air blowers in a wine production facility. And then you want to have hand sanitizing, so that most of the time it's just an iodine-based hand sanitizer. In terms of the concentration for iodine, you typically want to go 12.5 to 25. With chlorine, it's 100 to 200 parts per million free. And you want to monitor it to make sure that there's active amounts in whether chlorine or iodine at all times. And why a lot of companies use iodine is because iodine solution is brown, and as soon as it's used up because of hand sanitizing, it turns clear. So it's a visual indicator, and you don't have to use strips. And you want to make sure that these hand sanitizing stations you don't have them like on the other side of the facility so that they have to walk that far. You want to make them close to where the employees that actually need it can actually use it. Now, in terms of protection from adulteration, this is making sure that you don't have any microbiological, chemical, or physical contaminants that might get into your finished product, which is the wine. And these are like lubricants, fuel, pesticides, cleaning compounds, sanitizing agents, and even condensate or floor splash. So definitely do not pressure wash your drain when you have an inspector in there. So the basis for this is that FDA says that if you have any substance in your wine that could be considered hazardous, it's adulterated. And so as soon as it's been adulterated, you can't sell it. And they also have this little caveat where it says that if the wine, in this case, if the wine has been prepared, packed, or held under unsanitary conditions where it may have been contaminated with filth, and then it could be injurious to health, is adulterated. So this is where you want to make sure that your warehouse is in good condition as well, because that could be a potential violation that FDA could cite. So you want to make sure that the food packaging material, so that would be your bottles, and the food contact surfaces are protected from microbiological, chemical, and physical. So what you want to watch out for are toxic compounds. So this is your abrasive cleaner. It's any of your cleaning or sanitizing chemicals. So this is why when you're in production, none of those should be out on the production floor. And they don't want to see unsanitary water. So water from the floor, the drain, or even from the rafters entering into your wine. In terms of when to monitor, there is no specific. And so when FDA doesn't have a requirement in terms of how often you should be monitoring, they leave it up to you. So with sufficient frequency to ensure conformance, it basically puts the onus back on the company by saying, if you don't monitor, so technically, if you found a violation, you would have to go back to the last time you were actually monitored for that, and all the product between that time would be considered adulterated. So the less frequent results in larger volumes that you might have to deal with. But I would say that as a general, for the rest of the food and beverage industry, they do it at startup, and then they do it about every 4 hours during work, and then just throughout the day. Now, this comes down to your cleaning and sanitizing chemicals. So it's the labeling, storage, and use. So you want to make sure that all your chemicals are properly labeled. Remember having the exact label that the manufacturer has on your stock 50-gallon drum, and that they're properly stored. And we're going to go into, so for the labeling, it has to have the name of the compound or solution in the container, the name and address of the manufacturer, and then instructions for proper use. And then working containers have to have that exact same information. Now for storage, and this becomes an issue because and it's not only the wine industry, but a lot of food companies think that one of those storage cabinets with the locked door suffices. No, because the regulation says a room with a limited access. What will work is it's a caged area with a lock, that's acceptable, but the storage cabinet is not. And you don't want to have any of your food grade. So if you have metabisulfite, you cannot store that in with your toxic compounds. That has to be in a separate area. And you just want to keep it away from food equipment, utensils, and other food contact items. And then, as I mentioned in the sanitation, just use it according to the manufacturer's instructions. And what this does is it makes sure that it doesn't get too high of a level where it poses a health risk for anyone that's consuming your finished product. Once again, when to monitor, it's up to the company, but at least once a day is what people are saying. And what I usually recommend is you get your cleaning crew to actually check and make sure that all the chemicals are actually in that room or the caged area before they start up. And then if they're not, then you have to ask why they're not being there. And then just throughout the day. So if you saw that there was a cleaning or sanitizing chemical container out on the floor during production, you'd want to go and find out why it's actually out there. Then it even comes down to the employees themselves. So sometimes there are certain illnesses that may be indicative of foodborne illness, and those workers should not be in direct contact with the food. So you have to make sure that the employees are not contaminating either the food, the wine itself, the bottles themselves, or any food or wine contact surface that they might be working with. Now, there's what you want to be watching out for. Diarrhea can be an indication of foodborne illness. Sore throat and fever is usually indicative of more of a staph infection. Any type of fever indicates that they may have foodborne illness. And then open sores or cuts, because if they're infected, it's staph. It's a staph infection, and that can actually cause staph food poisoning. What you also want to be looking out for is vomiting, boils, jaundice, or dark urine. So the jaundice and dark urine is indicative of a hepatitis infection, and there is a foodborne hepatitis, and it's hepatitis A. And so you want to make sure that those employees aren't working in that facility, because it's highly infectious, and you'll probably get the rest of your employees infected with it as well. But if it did get into the wine, it would not cause the consumers to get sick. And then once again, it goes back to for management, set an example, okay, for your employees. Monitor your employees, and then give them the proper design and maintenance of the facilities. And then once again, provide training. For the personnel's responsibility, so technically, if they're sick, they should be reporting to you that they're sick. They should be washing their hands anytime after they sneeze, cough, or scratch their skin. And then just be aware of any type of other conditions that actually might cause contamination. Now, we're on to the last one, and this is exclusion of pests. Now, fruit flies, FDA, if it's a seasoned inspector, will not take issue with fruit flies because they're not the type of pests that actually spread foodborne illness contamination. But they do take issue with wine cats and dogs being in the production area. So, and the dogs and cats cannot be your pest control system either. That will not fly. So the reason why you don't want to have pests is because the insects and rodents can actually transmit foodborne illness, causing bacteria and parasites into the finished product. But fortunately, the wine will inactivate those. But this is why if you see rats, what you want to do is you want to control for their entry and exterminate the ones that are actually in the facility. So visually inspect for the presence of pests, or their fecal material that might be in the facility after they've taken up harborage. And then what's a really good idea in terms of how to avoid getting rodents taking up harborage in your facility is in your warehouse, stack it about 6 inches away from the wall. So rodents like to have hiding places, and because you've got it 6 inches away from the wall, that's a deterrent for them. And then just housekeeping. So it's the same. This is also really important for the spoilage microorganisms associated with wine. If you have a spill, don't leave the wine there. Flush it down the drain, get rid of it, because it's actually an attractant for fruit flies, which will spread the contamination around. So just and always try and do a full cleaning and sanitation after you finish production for the day. And then there's actually a 3-phase pest control program. You eliminate the shelter and attractants. So that's moving your stuff away from the wall and then flushing your wine down the drain, because that's what's going to be attracting them. And then exclude the pests from the wine production area. So sealing up holes. And then if you have any of those pests that actually enter there, you want to exterminate them. You can do a live trap and release them outside if you want to. Now, when FDA will come in, they'll also, not only will they look at your production facility, but they'll look around your facility, because they typically don't want to see tall grasses and stuff, because that's perfect hiding places for rodents. They'll look at your structure and layout, your the machinery, your equipment and utensils, your housekeeping in terms of the frequency of your disposal. That's another thing in terms of your waste disposal. If you have fruit flies and they're getting bad, especially late in the fall, what you can do is increase the frequency that you get your garbage taken, hauled away, because fruit flies, their life cycle, I think, is about 4 days. So if you leave it if your garbage pickup is once a week, you're allowing for fruit flies to bloom very quickly. And then just use the use of pesticides and other control measures. And with that is the skinniest, most basic food safety training that you can do and you can give to your employees. And now I will take any questions you might have now.
Andy, I see in the question and answer box, a question from Deborah. How many cases of foodborne illnesses per year are attributed to wine? I think that's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, 0.
Yeah. Nevertheless, we have to follow those rules that Randy just laid out.
Yeah, there's one other thing. I don't know how common it is in Washington, but it's back sweetening of wine with juice. Do any wineries do that?
Yes.
Okay. I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but technically you're going to have to comply with juice HACCP.
When you store and handle the juice.
Yeah, because it's the back sweetening. Because it's now no longer wine, it's juice that you're adding to wine, and that juice is subject to the juice HACCP regulation. I just bring it up now rather than you get dinged during an inspection.
That's irrespective of the fact that the juice would be hopefully at pH less than 4.
Correct.
You still need.
Yep. Fortunately, and we just published this study because it's not only wine, but it's also hard cider, where they back sweeten. And I mean, as part of that regulation, you have to do a 5 log reduction. So it was like, well, you don't want to heat up the wine. So, and because there's a lot of variability in the physiochemical properties of wine, we actually did a study showing how long it takes for the top 3 foodborne pathogens that FDA wants to see, how long of a holding time it takes after you back sweeten. So you don't have to do a treatment of the wine itself, but you just have to reference that paper. But we did it for the wine and cider industry because otherwise each winery was going to have to do it.
So this is treating the juice or sugar solution.
Well, no, it's when you take the juice and you add it to the finished wine to back sweeten.
Yeah.
After you add that juice back, you can put it in the bottle, and then you're not allowed to sell that bottle of wine for X number of days, depending on the pH, the pH and Brix level, and that's in the paper. And then related to that, juicer concentrate. So technically it would only be juice because the concentrate has already, if you're buying concentrate, it already has to be in compliance with the juice HACCP regulation. So if you're making your own juice, then you would have to, but if you're buying juice or buying concentrate, that you should be asking them for their juice HACCP certification. And then another question, what about tank entry when doing dig outs? What requirements are needed to follow for boots? So I would probably say that you have designated boots that are only for your cleaning and sanitation procedures. So you don't want to use boots that go outside and then back in. That's about the only thing I would say. And then another question, one of our previous inspectors commented positively about our use of bug zappers around the winery as a way of reducing insects. That really depends on the inspector, because I've seen inspectors freak out because when they do get zapped, it zaps them and it throws them, so they can actually contaminate the wine. So it controls it, yes, but at the same time it may introduce a contamination hazard. So that one really depends on your inspector. And then I have 2 people joining from, okay, I think this is when, if I'll hand it back over to
Jen.
Yeah, and you can do your spiel about how they get their certificate, and then in the meantime, we can also continue to monitor for any additional questions.
Yeah, so the question about getting your certificate, even if you are sharing a computer right now, what we're going to want is each individual person who has watched the webinar, we would like their first and last name and their email address. So in the chat, if you can either start now or when all the questions have been answered and we're done, just enter in each person's first, last name, as well as their email address. So then we can send each person's certificate directly to them instead of sending a bunch to one person. So you can start that now or whenever you're ready, but that's what we will need.
The chat says it's disabled.
Oh, Well, hang on, let's see if we can fix that.
Thank you.
Mhm. Everyone at the bottom for.
I have to say, one of the few positive things that came out from the pandemic is our ability to utilize Zoom.
Go ahead and try now. Oh, there we go. Perfect. So yes, name, first and last name, as well as your email address, please. Now you should be good to go. Sorry about that.
Perfect. Yeah.
All right, things are moving. Looks like there might be some more questions that have popped in, or are they just about?
There are some more. We answered Javi's. Deborah says, oh, thank you. No, I don't see any more questions that came in the, looks like everybody's entering their name and email address.
Well, I'll take the time right now to, as wine growers, we want to definitely give a huge thank you to Randy and Thomas, not only for today, but for all the prep work that you did and for all the coordination that you had with us. So we really appreciate not only your time, but your expertise. And this was great. So we also, real quick, will say another thank you to our AP sponsors, Series, Inland Desert Nursery, and Columbia Label. We will definitely follow up here with all of the recording to get out to all of you, as well as your certificates. You can expect those things end of this week or first of next week. If you end up with any other questions that you haven't submitted, please put that in the survey and we will get that to Randy and Thomas to get answers. And then that will also be sent out. So unless are there other questions that have popped in that need to be answered now?
Yeah, there is one regarding the protocol for the machine harvester. So it's still the 5-step procedure. So do a rinse first because it's mostly sugars that are going to be stuck to that unit and organic matter. So do a really good rinse to get rid of as much as the loosely bound. And then what works great is one of those pressurized vessels. So you have your detergent in there, spray the whole thing down, and then use brushes to scrub. More important, the actual the fingers that are doing the harvesting, and then do the rest of the equipment. Rinse, and then you can actually just spray. For that one, depending on when you're going to use it next, you could use a quat. That's a great one for especially at the end of the season. Put the equipment away, and the quat has activity that remains for months after. If you want a quick cleaning, you just do the same peroxyacetic acid.
There's one more thing I wanted to add is, so in the preparation for this seminar, we decided to do a Zoom format at this time. But we would like to know, that's the Washington Wine Growers and myself, whether there's any interest for in-person, hands-on sanitation seminar or other workshops that you would like to have presented. Then we'll try to facilitate that. So let either the wine growers or myself know what other training opportunities you'd like to have.
That would definitely be, there's a spot in the survey that the QR code is up for right now. You can put that in the chat if you want, but if you use the survey, there is a spot for other suggestions or that sort of thing to where you can type that in. So if you are interested or you think the industry would be interested in some hands-on in-person training, please add that into the survey and we will compile that information as well. Okay, well, if that, Randy and Thomas, if you think that concludes everything, thank you everyone for attending. We look forward to getting your certificates out to you and working with you guys in the future. Again, if you have any other questions, please throw those into the chat or into the question answer, or you can always email us here at Winegrowers and we will get that taken care of for you. Thanks again, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you all. Thank you, Randy, especially for taking the time at the end of your day.
Oh, well, thank you to the Washington Wine Growers and Thomas. It was nice reconnecting.
Great, fantastic. Thank you.
Bye-bye.